When the Carvers first arrived at the old Vermont farmhouse, they felt like they had stepped into a postcard. The rolling hills, the crisp air, the centuries-old beams that had weathered time, everything about the place felt serene. Mark and Dana Carver weren't exactly superstitious, nor were they the type to believe in ghosts. They were a couple in their late 40s, both working remotely, looking for an escape from the noise of New York City. When they found the property listing, a historic home once owned by Treat Williams, they were enchanted. It had been nearly 2 years since Williams' tragic motorcycle accident, and the house, despite its history, had been sitting on the market longer than expected. His family had moved on, reluctant to sell at first, but eventually decided it was time. "This house has soul," the real estate agent told them. "You can feel it." And they could. It wasn't the kind of cold, creeping sensation people talk about in haunted places. Instead, it was warmth, the kind that came from a home that had been lived in, loved, and cherished for years. For the first few weeks, life was bliss. They spent their mornings on the porch, watching the mist roll over the fields. Dana, an artist, found inspiration in the landscape. Mark, a writer, found the silence invigorating. Then small things started happening. A door left open when they were sure they had closed it. A chair slightly moved out of place. The old wooden floors creaking in the dead of night, long after they had settled in bed. First, they laughed it off. "It's a house this old," Mark reasoned. "It's bound to have a few quirks." But one night, Dana woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Soft, measured, deliberate. She held her breath, her heart pounding, and nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" He listened. The house was silent. "Probably just the wood settling," he muttered before rolling over. But Dana wasn't convinced. In the morning, she found the back door unlocked. "Did you forget to lock up last night?" she asked Mark over coffee. He frowned. "No, I checked it before bed." She didn't argue, but deep down, an unease had settled into her chest. That was the first night she saw the light in the barn. The first time Dana saw the light in the barn, she thought it was a trick of her tired eyes. A single warm glow coming from the loft window, soft, flickering, like the flame of an oil lamp. She stood at the kitchen sink, hands resting on the edge, watching as the light swayed gently in the darkness. It was past midnight, and the rest of the house was still. Mark had gone to bed hours ago, and even the wind outside had quieted, leaving only the distant whisper of crickets and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands on a dish towel, and stepped closer to the window. The barn was about 50 feet from the house, a grand but weathered structure, its red paint faded to a dull rust color. It had been part of the original property for nearly 200 years. The previous owners had used it for storage, leaving behind a few antique tools, an old wooden ladder, and dusty bales of hay that had long since lost their scent. The real estate agent had told them that Treat Williams had loved this barn. He would often spend time there, fixing things, working on small projects, enjoying the quiet. A single light bulb hung from the center beam inside, but it hadn't worked in years. Mark had meant to rewire it, but they hadn't gotten around to it yet. So how was there light? Dana's breath hitched. The glow was moving, shifting slightly as if someone were pacing inside. She reached for the back door, fingers grazing the cold metal of the handle, but stopped. A feeling, not fear, not exactly, but something close, curled in the pit of her stomach. She turned away. The next morning, the barn door was ajar. She found it that way when she stepped outside with her coffee, the damp autumn air clinging to her sweater. The heavy wooden door, which usually groaned on its hinges when pushed, stood slightly open, just wide enough to suggest that someone had passed through. Mark stepped outside behind her, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Did you come out here last night?" Dana shook her head, staring at the opening. The grass was wet with morning dew, but no footprints marked the ground. Mark sighed. Probably the wind. She wanted to believe him. That afternoon, she went inside the barn. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shafts of sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, illuminating floating particles in the air. The place was exactly as she remembered, empty, undisturbed. Except for one thing. In the middle of the loft, resting on the wooden floor, was an open book. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. The pages were yellowed, the binding cracked, but the words were still legible. It was a copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. She remembered seeing it once in a photograph of Treat Williams. He had been holding it, smiling. She bent down, hesitantly running her fingers along the worn edges. A faint breath of cold air stirred the hair at the nape of her neck. She wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw it, the presence. Not threatening, not oppressive, but unmistakable. The air shifted, a weight settling around her, as if someone were standing just behind her shoulder. A whisper of movement, the creak of a floorboard. She turned sharply. Nothing. The barn was empty. She exhaled, pressing the book against her chest as she backed toward the door. That night, the light in the barn returned. And this time, she wasn't the only one who saw it. The glow in the barn returned the following night. This time, it was undeniable, no tricks of the eyes, no passing headlights from some distant road. The light flickered steadily from the loft window, casting a faint golden hue onto the surrounding trees. Dana stood at the kitchen window again, coffee in hand, but her grip was tight around the mug, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Mark saw it too. He had come downstairs for water and found her standing there, rigid, her breath barely audible. When he followed her gaze, he muttered, "What the hell?" and moved toward the back door before she could stop him. Mark! But he was already stepping outside, the autumn chill curling around him like a slow exhale. The yard was silent except for the brittle crunch of dead leaves under his bare feet. Dana hesitated for a moment before following. The night smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As they crossed the distance to the barn, a low groan came from the wind catching in the eaves, stretching across the field like a whispered warning. The barn door, once slightly ajar, was now wide open. Inside, the darkness swallowed their shapes, their breath, the sound of their footsteps against the wooden planks. The only source of illumination came from above the loft. Mark reached for the old wooden ladder that led up to it. "If there's some kids sneaking in here at night, I'm gonna—" He didn't finish. The moment his fingers touched the first rung, the light above them vanished. Not slowly, not like a candle burning out, but all at once, like a switch had been flipped, like someone up there had seen them and decided, not tonight. Dana sucked in a breath, her body suddenly tense with an instinct she couldn't name. She grabbed Mark's arm, fingers curling into the warmth of his skin. "We should go back inside." Mark hesitated. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but after a beat, he let out a slow breath and nodded. "Yeah." They turned back toward the house, the cold air pressing against their backs. But just as they reached the door, a voice, low, indistinct, carried on the wind. Dana froze. So did Mark. They turned at the same time, eyes darting to the loft window. There was nothing there, no movement, no shadow, only darkness, but the air felt charged, thick with something unseen. She wasn't sure which of them closed the barn door that night. Neither of them spoke as they locked it. Neither of them spoke about what they heard. The next day, Dana searched for Leaves of Grass. She had left it in the barn, she was sure of it. But when she returned in the daylight, stepping cautiously into the loft, the book was gone. Instead, there was something else. A single sheet of paper, folded carefully, resting in the same spot where the book had been. Her heart pounded as she reached for it. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but legible. It wasn't typed, it was handwritten, in looping cursive. "I still have so much left to do." A sharp, cold shiver ran down Dana's spine. She turned, eyes scanning the empty loft. The dust motes hung in the air, unmoving, undisturbed. The light from the broken bulb overhead cast a pale glow across the wooden floor. She swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. Mark had been right about one thing: this house had soul. But Dana was beginning to think it also had a voice. And whoever it belonged to wasn't ready to leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Dana sat at the kitchen table, the yellowed paper resting before her like a fragile relic. She had read the words over and over, "I still have so much left to do." They looped in careful, deliberate strokes. The ink faded, as though time itself had tried to erase them. She traced her fingers over the handwriting, half expecting the ink to smudge beneath her touch. But it remained, as permanent as the weight in her chest. Mark hadn't seen the note yet. He was outside, checking the barn in daylight, trying to prove to himself that nothing had changed, that the night before had been nothing but the tricks of an old house and restless minds. But Dana knew better. She glanced toward the window, watching as he pulled open the barn doors. Sunlight spilled inside, cutting through the dark corners, revealing only dust and age. He stepped in, his figure partially swallowed by the shadows. Dana exhaled slowly, then stood, the paper still between her fingers. She made her way outside, her boots crunching against the gravel path. The air smelled like damp earth and the promise of approaching rain. A storm was coming, the kind that made the sky feel heavier, pressing down on the land like a held breath. Mark was near the ladder now, looking up toward the loft. "Dana," he called, his voice carrying a strange note, something between hesitation and curiosity. She stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. He pointed to the wooden floor near the ladder. "Look." Dana followed his gaze and saw it. The book, Leaves of Grass, sitting in the exact same spot as before, the pages slightly fanned open as if someone had just set it down. But she had been here earlier. It was gone. Her mouth went dry. "I swear it wasn't there this morning." Mark frowned, but he didn't dismiss her. He bent down, flipping through the pages. Dana stood frozen, watching as he scanned the words until he stopped. His brow furrowed. This wasn't here before. He turned the book so she could see. Passage was underlined. Not by the original printing, this was new, sharp and precise, the ink darker, fresher. "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." A slow chill crept up Dana's arms. Mark let out a breath, glancing up at her. "Someone's messing with us." Dana wasn't so sure. She crouched next to him, running her fingers lightly over the ink. It didn't smudge. Whoever had underlined it had done so deliberately, carefully. She looked up toward the loft, where the light had shone the night before. It was empty now, filled only with the dust of the past. But something about it felt different, as if it wasn't empty, as if it had never been. Then the barn door creaked. They both turned sharply. The door was moving, not from the wind, not from the uneven foundation, but smoothly, steadily, as though someone was pushing it closed. A slow, deliberate motion. Then the distinct sound of a footstep on the loft above them. A single, soft creak. Mark stood abruptly, his breath coming faster. "Hello!" Silence. Dana's fingers curled around the book. Another footstep, measured, heavy. She felt it in her chest before she even heard it, the weight of something unseen, something still here. Then a whisper, soft, almost mournful. "I'm not finished." A sudden gust of wind rushed through the barn, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The loft above them remained still. Dana and Mark stood frozen, the dust swirling around them, the silence stretching. The book in Dana's hands suddenly felt heavier. And for the first time, she wondered, had Treat Williams ever really left? The barn was silent, thick with the kind of stillness that made the air feel solid. Dust floated in the narrow beams of afternoon light, suspended as if time itself had slowed to watch. The wooden floor beneath Dana's boots felt unsteady, as though the boards might give way under the weight of something unseen. Mark's breath was uneven beside her. He was still staring at the loft, his muscles tense, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Then, another whisper. "I'm not finished." Dana clenched the book tighter against her chest, as if it might shield her from the words. But they weren't a threat. There was no malice in the voice, just something else. Something heavy. Regret. She swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Mark shot her a look, but she barely noticed. Silence. Then, From the loft above, the sound of something shifting. A slow, deliberate movement. Dana felt it more than heard it, the weight of presence, of something waiting. She took a step forward. "Dana," Mark said under his breath, but she ignored him. She placed a hand on the ladder, the wood cold under her palm. She pulled herself up one rung, then another, her breath tight in her throat. Each creak of the ladder echoed in the cavernous space. When her head cleared the loft floor, she froze. The air was thick, like stepping into a room filled with unspoken words. Dust motes swirled in the light filtering through the cracked window. The old wooden floor stretched out before her, empty except for one thing. A chair. A single wooden chair, placed carefully in the center of the loft, facing the open space below. And sitting on it, a script. The pages were stacked neatly, their edges slightly curled with age. Dana's fingers trembled as she reached for it. The cover was blank, no title, no name. Just old paper bound together. She flipped it open. The first page bore a handwritten note. The same looping cursive as before. Unfinished. She turned another page, then another. The words were there, typed in neat lines, but the story was incomplete. Sentences trailed off, scenes half-formed. A screenplay left unfinished. A story waiting to be told. A life interrupted. She exhaled, something heavy settling in her chest. "Treat," she whispered. The loft was silent, but then so softly she might have imagined it. The air stirred. A warmth brushed against her cheek, like a hand that wasn't there. A faint breath of something gratitude. Dana closed her eyes. She understood now. This wasn't a haunting, not in the way people feared. It was an echo, a voice that hadn't been heard, a presence that lingered not because it wished to terrify, but because it wasn't ready to be forgotten. She ran her fingers over the script, then carefully picked it up. The weight of it was real, solid, a piece of someone who had lived, loved, and left too soon. Below, Mark was watching her, his face unreadable. She climbed down slowly, script in hand. When she reached him, she held it out. This was his. Mark hesitated, then took it. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "It's not finished." "No," Dana exhaled. "But maybe it can be." She turned back toward the loft, staring up at the empty space where the chair sat. The air was lighter now. The weight had lifted. And somewhere, in the stillness, she thought she heard a whisper. "Thank you." The barn door swung open on its own. This time there was no fear, just the wind, just the past finally letting go. And as Dana and Mark stepped outside, the light in the loft flickered one last time, then went dark. The barn door groaned softly as it swung open, the dying light of the evening casting long shadows across the yard. Dana turned back once, her gaze lingering on the loft window. The light was gone. The presence that had filled the space, stretched through the silence, clung to the air. It was fading now, dissolving like the last note of a song. For the first time since they had moved in, the house felt still. Not empty, not abandoned, just at peace. Mark let out a breath beside her. "So, what do we do now?" Dana looked down at the script in her hands, feeling the weight of it. The unfinished words, the last echoes of a life that had once filled this house with laughter, with creation, with a presence too strong to simply disappear. She glanced back at the house, the warm glow of the porch light beckoning them inside. A thought settled in her mind, quiet at first, then clear. "We finish it," she said. Mark turned to her, eyebrows raised. Dana traced her fingers over the edges of the worn pages, feeling the indentations of words pressed into paper years ago. Words that had waited. Words that had refused to be forgotten. "We tell the story," she said, more certain this time. "It's what he wanted." Mark hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, maybe we do." A gust of wind rolled through the trees, rustling the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and rain. And for the briefest moment, so fleeting that Dana would later wonder if she had imagined it, she thought she heard a chuckle. A voice, warm and familiar, lingering just behind her ear. "That's the spirit." The wind died down. Dana smiled softly. Then she turned, stepping toward the house, script in hand. Behind them, the barn door eased shut, the night settling around it. The past had found its peace, and the story finally was ready to be told. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.